Welcome everybody to Equals. This is Max.
Welcome everyone to Equals, a podcast about hope in the fight against inequality. I'm Nabil. Welcome. It's season 4. Max, can you believe we're on season 4?
Yeah, season 4. Amazing.
Definitely not a one-hit wonder here.
No, our difficult second album is behind us. Glory awaits.
Yes, and many great albums ahead of us. I'm looking at my shelf. I'm looking at, Alicia Keys, Pharrell, great artists there,
Oh, maybe one or two others that I've actually heard of as
Uh,
well.
Coldplay, they had quite a good few albums. Nice British middle-class band.
Yeah, I'm such a huge Coldplay fan. Thank you, Nabil.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about vaccine inequality, about a massive decision that the US has taken, and we're talking about racism as well in the way that shaped the COVID response. We're talking about all of this at a time in which we're seeing, frankly, unimaginable scenes of despair in India, across Latin America. Over 20,000 people dying each day from this terrible disease of COVID-19.
It's really frightening. And it's frightening to think that when the history books are written, the last year, despite being so traumatic, could just be a prelude to the main pandemic. It's just insane.
It is indeed. And we are seeing these massive contrasts as well, aren't we, Max? And I do feel I need to say as well, the hope that there is in some parts of the world. I felt so happy seeing my mum, seeing members of my family, seeing you, Max, get the vaccine in the UK.
Yeah, I've never been so glad to be so old. But yeah, it is amazing. I'm volunteering at a vaccine centre, and you see the hope, the happiness that people have with feeling safe. And it's just criminal that we can't see that happening all over the world. Why must it just be in rich countries that people get to feel safe?
Criminal, I think, is the way to describe it, Max. Here in Kenya, for example, there are hardly any vaccines, and COVID itself has actually been its worst it's been since the start of the pandemic.
Yeah, you're just recovering from COVID yourself, in fact.
Yeah, that I have. It's it's the illest I've ever been. It wasn't easy. It was frankly scary because you are faced with your own mortality. Of course, I'm very lucky. I also exposed the many privileges that I have, but the overwhelming feeling coming out of it, Max, is that this huge vaccine apartheid that we're seeing, it's just not inevitable, is it? There's no real reason that Kenya and all these other countries should be going without vaccines.
Absolutely none. I mean, a year ago, the main obstacle to beating this cruel disease was science. But today it's inequality. That is the problem.
Yes, indeed. And we're seeing how at the heart of this issue are these big pharmaceutical corporations. We'll call them big pharma through the rest of this episode. Big pharma are really restricting supply, and it's rich countries which are standing by them, and that's what's perpetuating this apartheid. But we saw a momentous decision last week by President Biden to take on these monopolies. It's being called an unprecedented decision, something we haven't seen in close to a century. And now, Max, this is really significant, right? Because until now, Big Pharma, they've literally been calling the shots, right? Deciding how many vaccines get made, who gets them, what price to charge.
Yes, and up until now, for decades, the US government and Big Pharma have been in lockstep. So this is a momentous decision. And what's happened is what President Biden has said is he supports the lifting of monopolies and intellectual property rules at the World Trade Organization, which is something that South Africa and India and 100 countries have been calling for. And it would enable vaccine manufacturers to come forward and make these successful vaccines all over the world. So it would be a huge move if it happened.
A huge move, and it would help the production of billions of vaccines that the world really needs right now. And Max will be discussing with our guests, what does the Biden decision really mean? What comes next? And we'll also be exploring some of the racism, right? That's really shaping the way that the world has responded on this issue of COVID-19 vaccines.
Yes, and we're also going to be experimenting with bingo for the first time.
We'll be doing a round of Big Pharma bingo indeed, testing out some of the arguments that have been put forward. Max, have you got your bell there?
Yeah, hold on, wait a second.
Very high tech. Very high tech.
Oh, no, so pretty cool, eh?
And Max, we're joined today by 3 fantastic guests to walk us through all of this. We'll be kicking off with Priti, Krishtel and Tahir Amin. They're the co-CEOs of an organization called IMAC. They've been for many years fighting structural inequality in the medicine system. Priti's a lawyer, she's an activist, she's worked across the world. Tahir as well, an attorney. Tahir is actually a former intellectual property lawyer with multinational corporations, so that'll be interesting.
Yeah, he really knows where the bodies are buried. We're also going to be interviewing Asia Russell from Health Gap, who's a key player in the People's Vaccine Movement and a long-time HIV activist, and one of the people who's been lobbying the US government directly. So you get a really inspiring interview from her as well.
Yeah, we'll get the inside track there. Brilliant. Let's get to it.
Yes, let's.
Welcome, Priti. Welcome, Tahir. It's so great to have you both on Equals, especially as you've been quite rock stars, actually, of this global movement to take on big pharma and push for a vaccine for all. So a warm welcome to Equals.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Sorry, Max, I know you're dying to ask some serious questions, but
I am the Bill.
you are.
Is there a joke coming now?
There's always an intelligent joke coming. But look, Tahir, I've got to say, I read your bio coming to this interview. I see you're from a small working class mining town in the north of England, like quote unquote. And I just need to give a shout out to all of us who are from small working class towns in the north of England. You know,
I appreciate it, putting us on the map.
Yeah, exactly, putting us on the map. That's right.
But yeah, can I ask my clever question now?
Yeah, you go for it, Max.
Okay, so Priti, this one's for you. So we've been working on this for a year or so, really fighting for this issue of intellectual property and patents. But we saw Joe Biden, I think just a week ago, make that announcement that he wants to support the suspension of big pharma, intellectual property and monopolies on COVID-19 vaccines. Could you just kind of break that down for our listeners? How big a deal is that, and what difference could it make?
Sure. So I think it's a big deal. We've been doing this work for a long time, and we have never seen an American president say that intellectual property is something that can be touched, can be thought about differently, that the rights of corporations are not sacrosanct, even in the middle of a global pandemic. So to have an American president actually acknowledge that, it is a very big deal. At the same time, I think we have to remember all the administration said last week is that they're ready to have a conversation to support this waiver that India, South Africa, and 100 countries have asked for. So nothing's actually happened yet. Intellectual property hasn't been waived. It doesn't mean that we're going to all of a sudden see, 1 billion people vaccinated. We're just at the beginning of a very long road.
Yes, I think they've agreed to talks about talks, haven't they? But it's still an amazing thing. I think we were all, when you're campaigners, it's not often you see a clear-cut kind of victory and like that, but it also does feel like it's the beginning of a journey. So to hear what has to happen next then if we want to get from this commitment from Biden to billions more vaccines?
Well, I think the text now is going to be essential. So the statement that the U.S. administration put out just says that they're happy to waive. Well, they haven't given the exact wording, but they're prepared to waive IP on vaccines only. And you have to remember that the Indian South African proposal talks about anything that can be related to COVID-19, whether it be PPE, diagnostic, therapeutics. So I think what we're going to see is the sponsors, India and South Africa and all the other sponsors, go back to the drawing board and send some revised text. And then we're just going to have this back and forth. I think it was the DG of the WTO said she wants to get this done by December. I mean, we're kind of hoping that it moves a lot quicker than that. And, the other thing is that's really essential is that these agreements, these negotiations are actually transparent and public, because all trade deals are usually behind closed doors and we don't know the finer details. And it's important that we actually know what the hell's going on. So I think this is going to be really now a negotiation, and we're already hearing how there's immense pressure being put on representatives in the US from pharma. So you can bet your bottom dollar that there's going to be a lot of twists and turns between now and if there's going to be any final text.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And as we're seeing in Europe already, well, it was quite interesting because you saw, first of all, it felt like dominoes and quite a few European leaders kind of starting to speak out in favour of Biden's move. And then it felt like Chancellor Merkel telephoned them all at the weekend and said, get into line. And their position is very much hardening in the other direction. So, I mean, what do you think about that? How can you see an agreement being reached at the WTO if the EU become really quite intransigent?
I think there's a bit of good cop, bad cop going on. I think it's the US has led. I would be very surprised if this statement made by the US was not done with the EU not knowing. I believe that they probably talked about this and they're a bit role playing going on. I hope I'm wrong. But if you look at past negotiations and past sort of WTO stuff, the EU and the Europeans and basically the industrial North is always in sync when it comes to IP. There's no way that someone's going to do this and not be aware of what's going on. So they're gonna probably just jostle and play roles and sort of try and weaken any of the broader aspects of the initial proposal and sort of play different roles just to get it the way they want it. That's my sense, but I'm happy. I mean, Priti may have a different view.
I think you're probably right, but yeah, it's quite depressing.
Well, I don't want to speak for other countries. I'll speak for activists here in the US. And, we are working in solidarity with human rights organizations all over the world to really let the Biden administration know that global COVID vaccine access is a racial justice issue. And this administration has committed to racial justice. We're trying to be very clear that that's not just a domestic agenda. It has to be a global agenda.
That's really, really interesting, Priti, and I do value the way, actually, as we've gone through this journey, that racial justice lens has actually been more and more part of the discourse, and it is very clear to see is that we're energized on this side in terms of access to medicines and making progress, and I think I can only imagine the crisis meetings they had after the Biden decision and probably the money they've pumped into this. What I'd love to do with you guys is explore some of the arguments that big pharma are making right now in a very energetic way, both in the US but especially around the world. And Max and I, we've made a list of the kind of common kind of arguments that big pharma make, and we're going to go into a bit of a round of big pharma bingo, giving you guys maybe 30-40 seconds to answer each question. Is that going to be all right, and maybe a bit of fun?
Is there a prize at the end of it?
I don't know about a prize.
No, we only work for money, We're all for the profit.
I thought you left that industry.
Yeah, well, when I'm on podcasts, I'm looking for an earning.
We'll see what we can do. But I've got a bell as well, so this is. There you go. That's what's going to happen.
Good. That's very good. So, Priti, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Here's a common one, right? So, you activists, Biden now, you guys you're destroying incentives. This waiver is actually going to stop corporations from making vaccines, even boosters to the vaccine down the line.
I think that's rubbish. Vaccines are not actually a market that pharmaceutical manufacturers are incentivized to enter. That's why we've had $100 billion in government funding to create those incentives. IP has become a smokescreen that they hide behind to protect all of their earnings. But in the end, we've socialized the risk and we've privatized the profit. So the incentives are not actually gone.
Brilliant. Tahir, right, now your turn. Okay, we're paraphrasing a certain famous billionaire. He's quite big in the health area. It's not like there's some idle vaccine factory sitting around that magically makes safe vaccines. This is complicated.
Yeah. I wonder who that was. Basically, I mean, there are like 41, if you include Serum, vaccine manufacturers in developing country vaccine manufacturing network. They're all plotted around the global south, and they make over 3.5 billion doses of other vaccines. Some of them are WHO pre-qualified. So to say that there are not idle factories sitting around, I think is either Bill's gone a bit blind or he's got his favourites, which is Serum is definitely one of them. And having studied this area for other vaccines like human HPV and pneumococcal, there are a lot of actors out there who could actually be doing a lot more in this situation, and their capacity is not being used at all. Even companies in India who are not part of that network, who are actually could be doing more. I mean, there's companies that have got licenses for the Sputnik vaccine who are already sort of ramping up there, and just
Tahir, dearie me, you went over there, but it was interesting.
I know,
but
I was just getting started. No.
You were just getting warmed up, weren't you?
Yeah,
okay, go on then.
Good answer. Priti, over to you. This is honestly, this was one we kind of heard from Dr. Fauci, and in the days in advance of the decision. The waiver's actually going to slow the world down from getting vaccines. We're going to be going back and forth in these endless legal arguments about waivers. What would you say to that, Priti?
Let's talk about the facts, okay? The fact of the matter is that pharma themselves have admitted that they're only meeting 3% of their targets right now to getting vaccines to people worldwide. So there is no possible way that we could be going slower than we are right now. The fact of the matter is, if you don't have a waiver where we lift all forms of intellectual property, the industry is going to tie us up country by country, vaccine by vaccine in litigation. We've seen that already with treatments and other forms of medical products in this pandemic. Look at Gilead. They sued Russia on remdesivir. Like, we have so many examples of where IP litigation has already started. So let's stay focused. IP is an obstruction in a moment like this.
Very good. I'm not very good at counting time.
Great. This is great.
So Tahir, right? People are very serious about the safety of vaccines. The waiver leads to huge safety concerns for vaccines being made in the developing world.
Yeah, that all sort of scientific racism, as I call it. I've got another ready answer to use Boris Johnson's term. Basically, I tweeted about this, and I think this is just a smokescreen that they're putting up. Of course, everybody's worried about the safety of vaccines, but they kind of said this on numerous occasions with the HIV drugs when they said generics can't produce them, and they did. They've said that about hepatitis C drugs. They did the same. And I'm not saying that these small molecule drugs are the same as vaccines, but they even said that with when Shanta Biotech back in the 80s came up with their own version of a hepatitis B vaccine and used their own technology. And these very companies were saying, "Oh, you won't understand the technology. You can't actually make them." So this is again another deflection, just like the other deflections that they've said. What Priti has been talking about, and it's just classic pharma talking points.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think Max basically waits to hit the bell after he gets the answer.
I know. I wait for a nice full stop. I'm not very good at bingo.
I actually put the stopwatch on just to make sure I got it.
I love it. I love it.
We were talking recently with a senior journalist, and we're organising an op-ed, and he from one of these right-wing newspapers, and he said they even made mistakes at the Johnson & Johnson factory in the US. I mean, how could they possibly make these things in developing countries? Do you know what I mean? It's like the racism is not even subtle. I think it's disgusting. I mean, it really makes me angry.
And it is. And just to go there with that question, guys, and we've kind of finished our round of kind of big pharma bingo, so thank you for that. But you said it there, Tahir. There's scientific racism at play. Could we just explore that just for a sec? Because it did sound awfully like brown and black people can't be trusted to safely make vaccines. We seem to be the dog whistle to me. Do you think is that a fair thing that I'm putting there?
Yes, absolutely. This riles me up. If you take the case that Tahir was just talking about Shanta Biotechnic and the hepatitis B vaccine, this is what the same arguments they advanced then. And today we're seeing, what is it? Over 100 million people a year have been vaccinated because we achieved more suppliers. We achieved more scale, costs came down, and more people could get immunized. And every single time they point to safety because they know in high-income countries, people will fall for that. I've had in the last few days, decision makers and journalists admit to me that they heard that argument and they didn't question it even for a second. They were like, "Oh, well, if, it must be true that people in other parts of the world can't make safe vaccines." I think we really in the high income countries have to start questioning what is it that makes us fall for that line of argument so quickly. It's deeply problematic.
And I think credit to the Access to Meds movement, by the way, and a range of people who've started to be not started to be, have been quite vocal about this. Tahir, I saw your kind of tweet thread about this as well, picked up in the New York Times, and credit to them for covering it, because it is I think we easily call out dog whistle racism when it comes from right wing politicians. Right? There's a sense that it's a lot harder to do when it comes from industry, basically.
I just wanted to add, the Wall Street Journal has been at the forefront of this, leading this charge of what I call scientific racism. I mean, every other month they come out with some ridiculous point of view and talking point that is purely industry. And it's almost like they feel that their life's going to end because somebody else is going to make these vaccines in the IPR situation. But it really smacks of, if you read sort of all the Rudyard Kipling writings and all the old imperialist writings of the Europeans, it all smacks of all that. It's almost like these, the world has not moved on. And these guys are just really, if you read your history and you read even your fiction and your literature, it just smells of all that stuff. It's terrible. And I'm surprised that we're allowing this to actually even pass.
No, I hear you there. Oh, thanks, guys. We're wrapping up the interview at the end now, but I did want to ask something, just taking a big step back and closing with this question to both of you. We started by talking about the Biden decision, about how unprecedented that is. Now, you guys, you've got skin in the game on access to meds. You've worked around the world. You've worked relentlessly on this issue. My question to both of you, just to close in a short way, is do you have like substantive hope for change to this industry, to pushing back against big pharma? So for the system as a whole, that we can get, generic medicines to the world, to people in countries here like in Kenya who suffer because of the horrendous prices of treatments and medicines.
Absolutely, I have hope. And I can also tell you another thing. We are not going to rest over here in the US until we make sure that we push our administration to do right by the rest of the world. Like, we're not going to stop until we make sure that every country has received an equitable allocation of vaccines.
It's great to hear. I don't think it's going to be a fight, but I think we can win it. I really do.
Tahir, are you feeling that as well?
Yeah, no, I think this is a long road, but I think what's happened with COVID has opened a lot of windows and maybe even some doors. And I think we have to, as Priti says, we have to keep persevering. There's going to be a lot of obstructions, but I think there are people who are now talking about patents and IP and these deeper structural systems that we've never had, probably never talked about them or heard about them before. I mean, who would have thought that people are now talking about the WTO and the TRIPS agreement? I mean, the fact that that's probably trending more than it ever has is I mean, the stuff.
Yeah, we have a colleague, Heidi, here in the UK, and works for Global Justice Now, and she said she has never been more excited than when she saw TRIPS waiver trending on Twitter as an IP geek. But yeah, I think it absolutely, and I think in a way it feels like we've got a mountain to climb, but it does feel like we've really started. Thank you guys, that was really, really good. Great for the listeners to get into some depth on this amazing issue and this amazing fight. And yeah, thanks for coming on Equals, we really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. We're in it together. Thank you, guys. I really appreciated that interview, Max, with Tahir and with Priti. Look, there's many things to cover here in a second, but I think one thing we can agree on is bingo works.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the bingo, and yeah, especially the bell. Let me see. Let's
keep that handy. Keep that handy.
I'm definitely going to keep that handy, yeah.
And look, there's many points to cover here, but I do appreciate the point that they made about the caution by which we view the Biden decision. We've still got a mountain to climb. There's still a very fierce and maybe increasingly active big pharma lobby opposing us.
Yeah, and I also enjoyed the points about racism and what he called scientific racism. The idea that only rich white men in rich countries are clever enough to make these complicated vaccines. I think it's important we call that out.
That is something that does need to be called out and explored further. And that brings us nicely, actually, to our interview with Ece Russell to close this interview off. And we can talk about how racism has shaped the vaccine response more broadly.
So, Ece, welcome to your first Equals. So excited to interview you. You're such a towering figure in the access to medicines movement, and it's great you can be here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Ece, echoing Max here, and let's start by talking about racism. And you have called out yourself this kind of deeply colonialist response at play by rich governments. Can you walk us through this? What you've talked about here? I'm really interested to understand. Has racism shaped the way the world has dealt with COVID-19 vaccines?
It's shaped the response at every step, and that's part of both the legacy of global public health, but it's part of the here and now. It's part of the most powerful governments in the world, in particular my government, the US, exerting policy moves that determine whether the majority of the world's population must be told to wait in line for essential treatments and vaccines and suffer and potentially die. And when you look at who those communities are and where they come from, the vast majority are Black people and brown people. And the racialized outcomes in the US are catastrophic as well. And they speak to one another. And I guess the good news is the US government has the power to take action today that can transform that horrific, not just legacy, but reality right now of racism and colonial responses in public health, shaping whether fundamentally people get to live or die. I'm an AIDS activist, and my organization, Health Gap, got started more than 20 years ago because analogous dichotomies along racial lines were playing out in terms of access to triple combination life-saving antiretroviral therapy. And because of global solidarity, together we were able to put big pharma not only on its back foot, but to challenge the governments that were enabling their profiteering and frankly deadly actions. So we know it can work. We also know that that wasn't enough. And that's not surprising. This is a system of treatment and vaccine apartheid at its core that is not broken. It's the system working. So our task ahead is very formidable, but we are up to that challenge. I mean, the data in the US alone, for example, for any listener out there who's feeling hopeless or angry, the data actually indicate that more Americans agree that there should be and that there must be vaccines and treatments for all, a people's vaccine, than who don't. And that's extraordinary. I think that speaks to the moment that we're in. People are really outraged that this kind of inequity is making so many communities precarious, not only in the wealthiest countries where healthcare is not delivered as a right, but then much more so around the world where the vast majority, virtually all of the global south, has even yet to receive a first shot.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a historic moment. And it is amazing that the US government has, probably for the first time ever, said that they want to look at the issue of waiving patents. And in the center of the decision is this woman called Ambassador Tai. She's a US trade representative. She's made this historic decision. And you've met her, haven't you? And lobbied her in the run up to the decision. Did you see it coming? I mean, what's she like? What did you think at that point? And were you surprised when the decision was made?
I think it's clear that pressure from activists really triggered a reversal of course by the Biden administration. But the jury is out about exactly what it will translate into, because there's a deep concern that the US is right now only supporting a watered down version of a suspension of what are called intellectual property rights. So patents, but also trade secrets, know-how, everything that's bound up in the recipe that's needed to make COVID-19 vaccines and to make COVID-19 treatments. So what's happened is the Biden administration has taken a first wavering step. That's nonetheless momentous, and it's a testament to the power of activism. And you're right, it's Ambassador Tai who's been a crucial actor. Now, we met with her. It was a very brief meeting, but Ambassador Tai clearly indicated in that meeting that she recognized that a business as usual approach is not rising to meet the moment of catastrophe that the world is in. And I think what's quite important is what she said to us that day. She also repeated during testimony publicly to the Senate Finance Committee and to the House Committee on Ways and Means. And that was essentially that economies don't work if people are dead. Our global trading system, which in the case of the Biden administration, she oversees as something called the US Trade Representative, she was able to recognize that trade is based on people and it has to be accountable to communities. And that if communities have no security because they have no health, then trade doesn't work. And that to me is a step removed from the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, and certainly from the Bush administrations. So that's, I think, one of the most important things, maybe even more important than the substance of the waiver so far, because there's so much work left to do to ensure that that's substance and not spin. Nevertheless, she cannot step back from what she said, which is that intellectual property rights are obstructing access to the essential life-saving public goods that humans need in order to recover from this disaster, this preventable disaster of treatment and vaccine apartheid, and to build for the next pandemic. And that's where pharma is most concerned. They are petrified that this is the first step toward a recovery from not just inequity for COVID-19, but a break from this twisted system that puts profiteering and monopolies ahead of access for all.
Really well said there, Asia. And I can't help but feel this strange feeling of hope in relation to what Ambassador Tai said that I've never frankly I've never felt with the US government. So that is nice to hear. But at the same time, it does feel that our work is just beginning. More and more people are coming behind this cause. And Asia, many people are also going to be wondering, listening to you, to the podcast today, they're going to be wondering, what can I do? What can I do to support this effort? And you are a leader in this space. And what's your advice to them? What can people do to help win a people's vaccine?
Well, first of all, if you're not angry and you're not dismayed, then something's wrong. And we don't want you standing on the sidelines. We want you to join us because this is a global movement where, as I mentioned, the numbers are on our side, but we need more power. Global health at its core is about not evidence, but power. And who has the power to speak and to demand what they require and to act on their rights? And until we rebalance that imbalance, we won't transform this problem. So everyone listening, we need all hands on deck at this moment. And so go to the People's Vaccines materials online. It's peoplesvaccine.org. That's where you can tap into a global social movement built on intersectional, cross-cutting social justice movements from the global north and the global south, and dial into what's a groundbreaking effort to really confront and dismantle vaccine and treatment apartheid for COVID-19, but also to transform this system so it never happens again. I would also encourage people to visit freethevaccine.org to find out more in particular about what comrades in the US are doing in order to hold the Biden administration accountable. But you're not alone. If you're feeling dismayed, if you're feeling depressed by how terrifying the news is every day about vaccine apartheid, you're not alone. A huge vaccine for paralysis is activism. So we want you to join us. You are necessary for the success of this movement. With all hands on deck, we can move mountains together.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Asia.
I feel re-inspired.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, Max, what an interview. I mean, there are high days and low days, and we are in this struggle together, but I can tell you, I feel fired up listening to Asia.
Yeah, me too. Truly inspired. What an amazing woman.
What an amazing woman indeed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Our next Equals is going to be with the patriotic millionaires, with some very, very, very rich people, including Maurice Pearl, former managing director at BlackRock. We're going to be talking about taxing the rich, about the role of the rich, about class traitorism. It's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And as always, everyone, please share the podcast with your friends, your family, follow us on Twitter, and give us a great review.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.